Alright, welcome back. In this video, we're finally going to stop talking about so many different setup windows and all those parameter rollouts, although we are going to get into some parameters here. But we're finally going to start to get our hands dirty with rendering here and start doing some fun stuff. So it's about time. Let's go ahead and get started. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up some direct lighting. So what is direct lighting? Well, direct lighting is lighting that comes straight from lights to a surface, and that's it. There's no bouncing of light going on. There's no diffuse bounces. There's no indirect illumination like there would be in real life. So let's go ahead and see how direct lighting works. Now, if we do a quick render here just by hitting Shift and Q on the keyboard, this is what we get. We get a default render. We get no shadows. We get only the global lighting, which obviously looks very unnatural and not very nice. So let's close this. Let's go ahead and create a light. How do we create a light in our scene? Well, it's very simple. Over here, we're going to go ahead and go to the Create panel and go ahead and switch from Geometry over here to Lights. Click on the light icon there and you'll switch automatically to Lights. Now click on this drop down box. We're not going to use photometric just yet. We'll get into that in a little bit further down the road. But right now we'll start off with Standard Lights. So we'll go to Standard Lights and start the most simplest and easiest and most basic lights to set up. And we get different types of light options here. We get a target spot as well as a free spot, a target direct as well as a free direct, Omni, Skylight, and a complementary area lights, which we won't be talking about because those won't render with the Skyline renderer. You have to use the mental ray renderer for those to work. So we're going to talk about these 6 up here, which are going to work just good enough for to get you going here with lighting in 3ds Max. So let's start off with the target spotlight and create one and see how it works. Let me just zoom out here a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and click on Target Spot to activate the creation mode for Target Spotlights. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here in the center of the grid one time, and I'm going to drag out like this, and I'm going to let go of the mouse button. What this did was it created 2 objects. It created the light itself and a target for the light. The target for the light is this little yellow box that you see over here. The rest of this over here is the actual spotlight itself. You can see it creates this sort of blue cone shape right here, and wherever that cone falls, light is going to fall on. So it's almost like a flashlight, so to speak. Okay, so let's go ahead and use the move tool to move this light up above our scene a little bit, and I'm going to move it back this way so we get light coming from over here. Now let's go ahead and select the little target here, this little yellow target, and let's move it to the middle of our scene here so we get some light here in the middle. Okay, and this will allow us to get some pretty good lighting here distributed across the center of our scene, as we can see. Now we can see that the default global lighting disappeared, and that's actually normal behavior. Before a light is created so that you can actually see something, 3ds Max gives you that global lighting. As soon as you create a light, the global lighting is automatically turned off, which is obviously very useful. Okay, so here's our target in the middle, and here's our actual light. Now the target isn't really going to have the parameters to control the light, so let's click on the light over here, and now we can start to control this light. But first, let's hit Shift Q to do a quick render here, and we can see what we have. We have a pitch black scene, and then we have a spotlight effect right here down the middle. Whatever falls into the spotlight effect becomes lit up by the spotlight. So it's pretty simple. But this of course still looks very unnatural. We don't have shadows, the lighting is too evenly distributed, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't look that good. So let's close that. Let's also see how we can go ahead and see our lighting in real time in the viewport. This is an awesome feature in 3ds Max 2009, which I'm sure you're going to love. First thing we're going to do is activate this light in the viewport. So, with the light selected, we'll right click to open up a quad menu, and we'll go up here to Viewport Lighting and Shadows. We'll go to Viewport Shading. We have to make sure that our Viewport Shading is, by default, it's going to be set to off, but we have to make sure that it's set to best. Best is going to use Shader Model 3.0. Good will use Shader Model 2.0. Now, your video card may or may not support Shader Model 3.0. Make sure you have the latest hardware and the latest video cards so that you can take advantage of Shader Model 3.0. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Best, and that's automatically going to improve the way that my viewport looks. As you can see, now there's a huge difference. My viewport looks almost how my render looks, but we can still do a little bit more. Let me go ahead and right click again to open up the quad menu. Let me go to viewport lighting and shadows. With that light selected, I'm going to go ahead and go to select lights displaying shadows. I'm sorry, edit that out of the video. Edit that out of the video. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to do is go down here to enable viewport shadows selected. And what that does, it enables the viewport shadows for the current light. So now when I come in here, I can see I have shadows in the real-time viewport. And this is just great for showing you how the shadows are going to be shaped, how far off they're going to go, and so on and so forth. Now, it doesn't give you a one-to-one accurate display of what the shadows are going to finally look like, but it's pretty close, as you can see. Okay, so now let's start to edit this spotlight here and, well, change its effects on the scene. So let's do that simple and very easy. Make sure that the light is selected. We'll go over here and switch to the modify panel, and here we have all the parameters that we can adjust on this light. You can see we have a lot of different parameter rollouts to adjust the way that this light works. In the general parameters, we can change the light type. So by default it's set to spot because I selected to create a spotlight. But I can also switch it to a directional light. I can also switch it to an Omni light. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. Let's go back to spotlight. Spotlight again works almost like a theater spotlight or a flashlight. The light is directed toward a certain angle and a certain radius. Gives you a lot of control as to what you're going to light up in your scene. We can also switch on targeted or non-targeted. So if I turn on targeted, I have my little target icon that I had before. But I could also turn that off, and essentially this will be a free spotlight as opposed to a targeted spotlight. I'll switch it back to a targeted because that's what we started off with. Shadows are default set to on, so this light is creating shadows. Now we have different shadows that we can create. Let's go ahead and render this out right here. Okay, now if we click on this drop down box, we can see we have different shadows. We have advanced ray trace shadows, we have mental ray shadow maps, area shadows, shadow maps, which is the ones that we're using now, and ray trace shadows. Now, mental ray shadow maps will only work if you're using the mental ray renderer, and since we're not using mental ray renderer, we're not going to be talking about mental ray shadow maps. So, what do these different shadow types do? Well, the different shadow types have different benefits and have different drawbacks to them. For example, shadow maps, which is the default, are the fastest to render. However, they require more memory than ray trace or advanced ray trace shadows. Shadow maps are also very good because they render quickly and they don't take a lot of CPU power to render out. And they can look pretty nice, as you can see. They're nice and soft back here, but they're more hard-edged over here closer to the object. So they can be pretty accurate, at least to the naked eye, even though they're not perfectly physically accurate, or as physically accurate as, say, area shadows. Now, the drawback to shadow maps are that they require more memory for you to render. The other drawback is you can't do transparency shadows with shadow maps. So if you're doing, say, a see-through piece of glass, a glass cup or something, and you're trying to create shadows with it, you're not going to have physically accurate shadows, and your scene's going to look a little bit awkward. So that's just one thing to take into account when working with shadow maps. Then we have area shadows. Area shadows are great shadows because they're so physically accurate. Let's go ahead and render that out. They take longer to render, but the benefit is they are physically accurate. With area shadows, you're going to get probably the most physically accurate you can possibly get out of the scanline renderer. So they look great and they render fantastic. The problem is they take longer to render than shadow maps. So again, you have to balance things out. Quality versus speed. Then we have advanced ray traced and ray trace shadows. These are going to be also physically based shadows, but you're going to notice that they are hard edged, as you can see. But they create great shadows when you need transparency shadows and when you need to create shadows through transparent objects, and they do render faster than the area shadows. So that's one thing to take into mind whenever you're going to go ahead and set up the shadows for your scene. So each different type of shadow has its benefits and its drawbacks, so you kind of have to juggle them around and decide what kind of shadows you're going to use and which one you need for your scene. So for example, if you cannot compromise quality and you can put up with the high render times, you might want to stick with area shadows. If you're going for speed and you don't mind a little bit of physical inaccuracy, you might want to go with shadow maps. So I'll switch back to shadow maps just for the time being. Down here, we have an intensity, color, and attenuation parameter rollout where we can change the color of the light. So I can go ahead and click this color box. By default, it's set to white, and I can create, say, a yellowish light. You can see now that the lighting in my scene is in fact yellowish. Let me switch that back to white. I have a multiplier as well where I could change the strength of the light. Right now it's set to 1. So if I were to set this to 5, now my light is going to be multiplied by 5, which is going to blow it out and make it very, very bright. Alternatively, I can make it, say, 0.25 and make this light very, very dim and barely affect the scene right there, as you can see. Then down here we have decay. Now, decay can be found in many other 3D software packages. What decay does is, by default, it's set to none, by the way. And if there's no decay, what happens is that the light evenly distributes across the scene. Imagine taking a flashlight in real life and just taking it outside at night and turning it on, and the flashlight lights up evenly forever, for infinity. I mean, you could light up something in front of your hand the same way that you could light up a rock on Mars. And the intensity of the light would be exactly the same as if it were in front of you and as if it were on the surface of Mars. This obviously is no good because it's unrealistic. Now, maybe you're going for unrealistic, so if that's the case, you'll want to keep the decay to none. However, if you're going for a realistic render, you cannot use decay set to none because your render will not look realistic. So we need to use decay. Decay is used by real light energy in real life. Now we have two types of decay. We have inverse, which creates linear decay, which looks better than no decay, but is not physically accurate. If you want to go for physically accurate photorealistic decay, go for inverse square. Inverse square applies the correct formula to lighting, so now you'll see that the light is strong or stronger back here than it is over here at the end. And if I increase the multiplier, it'll become more evident, as you can see in this test render. You can see the light is much brighter over here, although it's still pretty dim. You can see that the light has more influence here on the right than it does on the left part of the scene over here, where the light starts to decay and die off. So light decay is very important for creating more realistic lighting in your scene. Okay, let's go ahead and collapse that parameter and move on to the spotlight parameters. With spotlight parameters, we can control the hot spot or the beam of the light, as well as the fall off or the field. So let me close this and let me show you how that works. If we go ahead and change the beam, we can change the size of that beam, so we can see that the beam now can reach a much larger radius. We can also change the fall off, which is going to control the softness. So if I take the fall off all the way down so it's really close to the value of the beam, whenever I go ahead and render this, you'll notice that right here we get this really hard edge, which can look a bit unrealistic. But if I go ahead and increase that fall off field, so now the field or the fall off is much larger than the value of the beam or the hotspot, now when I render, you'll notice that now this becomes much softer and a bit more realistic, which might be what you want for your scene or might not, depends on what project or what look you're aiming for with your render. Okay, and down here we have different parameters. For example, we have advanced effects over here where we can change the contrast of the light. We can also soften the diffuse edges. We can also tell the light to not emit diffuse color and only emit specular. As we can see, now we only see specular lighting in our scene. Or we could turn on diffuse and turn off specular, so now we only see diffuse. Or turn on specular and diffuse, so now we see those diffuse specular, or those specular reflections right there. Or we could tell the light to render out ambient only, so we get only ambient lighting. We also have shadow parameters here. So we could change the different parameters of the shadow. For example, we could change the shadow color. So right now our shadow color is set to black. We could change the shadow color to say sort of this light blue color, and now we'll see that our shadows have this light blue color. So it's pretty much what you see is what you get. The parameters are pretty straightforward and pretty easy to get, even for someone who's never changed these parameters before. All you have to do is kind of unnerve yourself and come in here and play around with these parameters, and you'll start to understand how they work. We can also change the shadow map parameters. By default, the shadow map size is set to 512. So let me show you how that works. Let me zoom in here on, say, this teapot here. Do a render. You could see the quality of the teapot shadow map here is not very high. It has a lot of artifacting and doesn't look too good. It looks very low resolution. So I could change the shadow map size to say 1024, double the size of before. And now when I render, now the shadow map is starting to look really good. Of course, increasing the shadow map size will increase your render times and increase the memory usage you'll need to render out. So now I doubled it again to 2048, and now you can see I'm getting some very nice detailed shadow maps. Let me change that back to 1024. I can also change a few different things here, like the sample range and the bias. So if I change the bias and increase that, now we can see I get a more blurred shadow, kind of like an area shadow. So you can try to imitate area shadows with shadow maps to try to trick the viewer into thinking they're looking at area shadows, when in fact they're looking at shadow maps which render faster. Then we have atmosphere and effects. Atmosphere and effects allow you to adjust certain little parameters here. So we'll click on add, and for example we'll click a volume light, click OK. And now what happens is if I render this out, you notice that now I have a volume parameter attached to this light, so I can get this sort of fog effect. If I click on volume light and click on setup here, I can adjust the volume light. And you'll notice that this takes us straight to the environment and effects window, just like what we had looked at before in a previous video. Here's the volume light parameter, and we can adjust it here. Just scroll down and you'll have this volume light parameters rollout where we can change the volume light parameters. So right now, for example, our density might be too high at 5. We'll change it to 1. We'll hit render, and now it makes the effect a little bit more subtle. So now you get this nice sort of fog effect that which can look pretty neat in the scene. So let me go ahead and close that, and now I'm going to take this volume effect and delete it to get rid of it completely. Down here we have a couple of mental ray parameters. Again, these will have no effect on the render because we're not using the mental ray renderer, so they won't show up when we render. So that pretty much covers it for most of the basic parameters and some of the most commonly used parameters with standard lights in 3ds Max. Now I'm going to move a little bit quicker here because we're going to move on to other lights. I'm going to select this light and I'm going to hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of it. I'm going to go back to the create panel, and with light selected, I'm going to go ahead and create a different light. Now a free spotlight, if I go ahead and create that, all that's going to do is create a spotlight just like before, only it's not going to have a target point to look at. If I want to create a target point for it because I changed my mind for whatever reason, I can go to the modify panel with that light selected, and you'll see down here we have the targeted parameter. If I turn that on, this will become a targeted light. Essentially, the only difference between a target spotlight and a free spotlight over here in the create panel, here's the target spot and here's the free spot. The only difference is that the target spot has this targeted parameter checked on, and the free spot has the targeted parameter checked off. That is the only difference between those two lights. Everything else is the same. The shadow parameters are the same, the intensity and color are the same, and so on and so forth. So there's virtually no difference except for that one indiscrepancy. Okay, then we have target direct light and free direct light, which are virtually the same, but you probably guessed it. The target direct light has a target point while the free direct light doesn't. So let me go ahead and delete that spotlight, and let's create a target direct light. So I'll create the target direct light like so, similar to the spotlight, and then I'll move it up here like this, and there we go. We'll render that out, and this is what we get. Similar to a spotlight, but not quite. The direct light works like a sunlight. It shoots parallel light rays, which basically means that it doesn't work with attenuation. This light is excellent if you're trying to do a sunlight in your scene that encompasses an entire exterior scene. Say if you're doing an architectural scene or some kind of environment scene that takes place outdoors. This light is perfect for creating that type of a light scenario. Okay, so the parameters are basically the same. We have shadow parameters. We also have directional parameters here specific for this light. For example, we could change the size of this of the hot beam here, of the hot spot and beam. So we get something that looks like this. Okay, but everything else is pretty much the same. The shadow map parameters are the same, so is the atmospheres and effects. We also get intensity and color, which is the same as before, just like with the spotlights. We could turn on shadows here, and so on and so forth. We can also switch back the directional light to a spotlight or an Omni light, and we're going to talk about Omni light next. So let's select this directional light, hit delete to get rid of it, and now let's go ahead and let's come up here and let's create an Omni light. Let's go up here and you'll see Omni light right here, and there is no target Omni light. There's just one Omni light, and you'll see why in a moment. Let's go ahead and create one of these, and let's move it up above our scene, and here's the Omni light. The reason that there is no target for the Omni light is, well, pretty simple. The Omni light works like a light bulb. It shoots light in every direction, above it, behind it, in front, to the sides, below it, everywhere. It's shooting out light evenly. And if we go ahead and go over to the Modified tab, we can see a targeted is grayed out. And that's because you can't target this thing. It's not a flashlight and it's not a spotlight. It throws light in every single direction. But we still have all of our common parameters here. We can, for example, turn on shadows. We can also change our intensity and our color, and we can affect different things. We have advanced effects. We can also change the shadow parameters as well as the shadow map parameters, and we can add atmosphere and effects to it. And that pretty much does it. The Omni Light's pretty easy to use, pretty simple and straightforward. All it is basically a light bulb inside of 3ds Max, and you can see if I place that light bulb here in the center how it's shooting light in every direction and casting these shadows. So Omni Light is pretty easy and pretty straightforward. There's really nothing difficult or nothing extraordinary about it. It's just a light bulb in 3ds Max. So let's move on to the next light type here, which is Skylight. Now Skylight is a very interesting light, and you'll see why in a moment. Let's go ahead and create a Skylight here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the Skylight, doesn't matter where you place it. If I move it up here, or if I move it to the side over here, or leave it in the middle of the scene, it won't make a difference as to how the lighting in the scene is going to be made. Okay? Now, the Skylight is best used for creating environment light coming from, well, you guessed it, a sky in your scene. So it's perfect for doing outdoor scenes. If you're doing any outdoor architectural scenes or any type of outdoor environment, the Skylight is perfect for creating this nice, soft, subtle environment skylight effect in your scene, which looks beautiful. Let's do a quick render and see what we've got. Okay, that looks horrible. And that's okay. That's the way that it comes out by default. That's because the shadows are turned off. So you can see we get this even ambient lighting across everything. So let's turn that off and let's go to the Modified tab so we can see what parameters we can adjust for the Skylight. Now the Skylight, unlike the other lights, has very few parameters to adjust. It doesn't have 1001 parameters to adjust. It basically has an on switch that turns it on and off, and a multiplier that changes the intensity of the light. Now you can't use decay with this light, since it's an environment light that goes across the entire scene. Wouldn't make much sense to use decay. Now, for the sky color, we can use the scene's environment color, which if we go over here to the rendering menu and we go to environment, we can see that we have an ambient color here as well as a background color. This is the environment color. So we could tell it to use that environment color, or we could tell it to use the sky color that we choose here. So we can choose a sky color here. By default, it's set to a very, very desaturated, bright bluish color. Okay. We can also tell it to use a map. So we can plug in a color map here of anything we want. So say if we have a sky image on our hard drive, we could click here on bitmap, and we can go ahead and load up an image, and it can accept different types of formats of images. Bitmaps, it can accept HDR images, high dynamic range images. It can accept JPEGs and OpenEXRs, Targas, TIFFs, you name it, it could probably accept it. Oh, let me go ahead and clear that out there. I accidentally set up a map. I don't want to set up a map right now. Okay. Then down here under render, we could tell it to cast shadows. So let's tell it to cast shadows. I'll turn that on, and it was turned off by default. You're about to see why. Let's do a render. And you can see that the render slows down by quite a bit. I'm going to go ahead and pause and skip into the future so that we don't have to sit here and wait through this. Okay, so I skipped ahead the render so that you wouldn't have to sit here watching this render so slowly. And we can see we get a very nice ambient effect. We have these beautiful soft contact shadows here around all of our objects, and we get this beautiful ambient lighting. This is great for doing outdoor scenes, and what you would want to do is add a sunlight to this to complete the effect, and then you have yourself a nice outdoor lighting setup. Now, the problem with using the skylight is that it takes so long to render, so that's one thing you have to be aware of. You get beautiful renders, but you get slow renders, which could be a problem. So that's just one thing to take into account. Now, one of the reasons why it took so long to render is because by default, the rays per sample parameter was set to 20. Now, 20 is a very high number of samples to be calculating for the shadows. So while you're doing test renders, you might want to knock those samples down to something like 8. And now if we do a test render, you'll notice that we render a lot faster than before. As you can see, we're rendering more than twice as fast as before. Now the drawback is that despite the fact you're rendering quick, the shadows are coming out very grainy with artifacts. And if I get closer here, you can see what I'm talking about once we inspect this a little bit closer. So as you can see in this close-up render, by using a lower number of rays per sample, only 8, we're getting this very grainy, very dirty and ugly looking render, which is good for when you're doing test renders and just trying to see how things are coming along. For a production render, you want to increase this back to 20. You don't really have to go past 20, however. It's really overkill if you do that. So keep it at a max of 20 and don't really go over that, because you'll be really blowing out your rendering times like crazy, and you don't want to end up doing that. Okay, so that's the skylight. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that more than previous videos. We finally got in there and got our hands on some of the different light types and things inside of 3ds Max, and saw how we can create some pretty interesting lighting in 3ds Max using direct lighting techniques, as well as some ambient lighting here using the skylight inside of 3ds Max 2009. So that's going to do it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.